For years, the national rhythm had been defined by movement. Daily updates, visible action, momentum without pause. Attention stayed fixed on the present. Each day replaced the last. There was no empty space in the cycle. No silence long enough for older questions to return. Then, in early 2020, something arrived that did not follow the pattern. It did not compete for attention. It consumed it. At first, it felt distant. A health crisis unfolding elsewhere. Reports from abroad. Statistics from other countries. But distance narrowed quickly. Within weeks, the language changed. Lockdown, quarantine, community transmission. The rhythm stopped. For the first time in years, the cycle did not accelerate. It froze. Movement, once constant, became restricted. Streets emptied. Businesses closed. Daily routines halted. Emergency measures replaced ordinary governance. Temporary powers were invoked. Procedures were shortened. Urgency took precedence over sequence. The crisis was no longer political. It was immediate. Health systems strained. Decisions had to be made quickly. The focus narrowed, not to investigations, not to prior controversies, but to survival. Oversight did not disappear, but it was no longer central. The emergency defined everything. For the first time in this series, the pattern did not continue. Through replacement, it was suspended. The present did not crowd out the past. It overwhelmed it. And in the space created by emergency, new pressures began to build. As the lockdown began, authority consolidated. Emergency legislation was passed. To respond quickly to a rapidly spreading crisis, temporary powers were granted. Budget allocations were realigned. Spending mechanisms were simplified to accelerate response. The emphasis was speed. Medical supplies needed procurement. Facilities required expansion. Financial assistance had to reach households quickly. Process shortened. Approval timelines compressed. In ordinary times, public procurement follows layers of review. In emergency conditions, layers are reduced. What matters most becomes delivery. Oversight was not removed, but it moved behind urgency. The priority shifted from verification to availability. Funds were redirected. Budgets expanded. Borrowing increased. To sustain emergency programs, the scale of response grew rapidly. Under pressure, governance adapts. Rules bend toward speed. Sequence yields to urgency, and in that urgency, something familiar returned. The quiet tension between action and accountability. As emergency spending expanded, scrutiny began to follow. As emergency spending expanded, the financial scale of response grew rapidly. Billions were allocated for health systems, social assistance, and economic stabilization. Speed was the priority, but scale brings complexity. Over time, audit reports began to surface, not accusations, but observations, flags, notations, requests for clarification. In emergency conditions, documentation often trails delivery. Procurement under pressure is rarely flawless. Global demand strained supply chains. Prices fluctuated. Delivery timelines shifted. Oversight mechanisms worked to catch up. Hearings were conducted. Officials were questioned. Explanations were requested. The language became technical, focused on compliance, documentation, and procedure. At the same time, borrowing increased, revenue contracted during lockdown. Spending expanded to sustain relief and recovery. Debt levels rose as part of the emergency response. These developments did not exist outside the crisis. They were part of it. Emergency response requires resources. Resources require trust. When urgency leads, oversight follows. Sometimes immediately, sometimes gradually. The tension between the two is structural. In crisis, money moves quickly. Understanding how it moved takes longer. And as the emergency stretched into months, the question shifted from response to recovery. As weeks turned into months, emergency response became prolonged governance. With time, scrutiny grew more structured. Questions shifted from immediate supply to sustained accountability. Audit reports became more detailed. Findings were catalogued. Clarifications requested. Compliance timelines extended. Oversight did not disappear. It matured. Public briefings evolved. The language shifted from emergency alerts to procedural updates, from daily urgency to measured review. The first phase demanded speed. The second phase demanded explanation. But explanation moves slower than crisis. As documentation accumulated, complexity increased. Multiple agencies, multiple programs, multiple funding streams. Understanding required patience, and as attention shifted to vaccines, reopening, and recovery, earlier procurement concerns no longer dominated conversation. They remained active, but no longer central. The emergency phase gave way to adaptation. Adaptation gave way to normalization. Oversight continued within that new rhythm. In prolonged crisis, scrutiny does not vanish. It changes form. But as form changes, visibility often declines. And while the country adjusted, something else was quietly reshaping the future. Emergencies end, but their financial footprint remains. When economies slow, governments borrow. When revenue falls, expenditure fills the gap. During the pandemic years, public borrowing increased significantly. Not uniquely, not unusually by global standards, but decisively. Debt became the bridge between shutdown and survival. Future budgets adjusted accordingly. Servicing debt required allocation. Recovery required investment. Infrastructure, health systems, and economic stimulus competed for fiscal space. Reopening demanded momentum. Projects resumed. Businesses restarted. Movement returned to the streets. But recovery carried cost forward. Debt is not immediate. It is gradual. It shapes future flexibility. It influences future choices. It does not dominate headlines, but it persists quietly. As visibility shifted from crisis to reopening, financial consequence moved into the background. Attention returned to movement. The long horizon rarely competes with the present. Emergency borrowing stabilized the moment. But stability now requires discipline, planning, restructuring, sustained growth. The crisis passed. The balance sheet remained. And like every unfinished chapter before it, its full meaning would only emerge with time. And as recovery reshaped priorities, the cycle quietly began again. As recovery took hold, movement returned, streets filled, commerce resumed. The stillness that defined 2020 gave way to familiar motion, and with motion came new headlines, new debates, new controversies. The national conversation shifted again. Earlier issues did not vanish. They remained in records, in court dockets, in audit reports. But visibility moved forward. Recovery required focus. Focus narrowed attention. Attention narrowed memory. And once again, unfinished questions drifted toward the margins. Time does not wait for resolution. It carries the system forward, each year layering over the last. The cycle did not break. It resumed. New urgency replaced old urgency. New focus replaced old focus. What remains constant is not the issue. It is the rhythm. Attention rises. Attention shifts. Attention settles. And as the country moves forward once more, the question returns. Not what happened, but what was left behind when the next headline arrived. And each time, attention moved forward. Not always because questions were answered, but because something new required focus. The institutions remained. Hearings were held. Reports were filed. Decisions were recorded. But visibility shifted. What fades is not always the issue itself. It is the urgency surrounding it. And without urgency, resolution becomes procedural, not collective. This series is not about assigning guilt. It is not about reliving outrage. It is about memory, because a nation does not forget in one dramatic moment. It forgets gradually, layer by layer, headline by headline. The pattern is not unique to one administration, not unique to one crisis. It is structural. Attention rises. Attention shifts. Attention settles. And so the question remains. Not what dominated the headlines, but what remained unresolved after they disappeared. This is after the headlines, because the story doesn't end when the news does.